Well, hello. I'll continue a little bit with Rollo May. If you didn't see the introduction, you can go check out that video, the one before this one. So anyway, he's talking about how human beings are kind of mechanized, and that's an old term. Back in the 50s, mechanization, it's more salient. But he's just saying that this model comes into our social life and our culture and economic life, psychological life, religious life, medical life, the whole nine yards. So I left off last time with, how getting in touch with your authentic creative self is good for you in many, many ways, and your community, your people. It creates a more healthy person, and it's good for the world. And this is very profound, I think. He says the human being is characterized by the capacity to be conscious of himself, to pause between the stimulus and the response, and to be aware that the stimulus is acting upon him. It is at this point that we can no longer talk of determinism of the human being. I think the argument of freedom against determinism with respect to human beings is basically a false argument. It rests on the premise that are not adequate to the human being, on premises that may be adequate to other species of animal life, certainly are adequate to inorganic life, so pool balls, astrophysics. But there's something about human beings that's a bit more complex and deeper in terms of consciousness than, let's say, an ant or even a dog. But with the human being, the distinctive characteristic is always that he can be self-conscious, that he can know himself as the person who is being determined. And once he knows himself as the person who is being determined, then no longer is he only the object of the stimulus. In that pause, no matter how slight, no matter how instantaneous it may be, in that pause, in which I know that the conditioning in a given situation is coming to me, lies my freedom and my capacity to throw my weight on one side or the other, so that I am no longer merely an object of what is happening to me. Well, Daniel Dennett or Sam Harris or whatever. So I'm more of a compatibilist in a lot of things. So I'm also a little bit more of a holist, if that's a thing, because I know that the body and the mind are complex, is a complex interactive whole of a number of other systems, right? And so is society, and so is the universe and physics and everything else. So we can break things down mechanically and understand how they work. We can build complex machines like a jet airplane, but a jet airplane isn't going to evolve into a human being. The things in the universe aren't going to evolve into an airplane without a human being. So, I'm not a complete, deterministic type person. I think the more you dig into these things, the more you can see varying angles and sides of these arguments, and you can understand that depending on your perspective, your willed, chosen perspective, if you will, the data you look at, the way you look at something, the perspectives you take, the things you focus on and concentrate on, affect your argument and your logic and the way you gather evidence for your argument or your experiment or whatever. But obviously there's, it's very deep stuff. So he says, he goes on this simple basis comes the freedom which makes man eventually able to stand against the juggernaut of modern economic determinism of history, to transcend to some extent the tremendous threat of atomic warfare, to transcend the other movements of a modern century which would overwhelm the human being and make us simply the victim of the mechanized development. This capacity to be aware of what is happening to you and thereby to have some hand in the modeling of it shows itself in four main ways. It shows itself in man's capacity to reason. Reasoning is a matter of making symbols, the abstract from the immediate situation in which we find ourselves through agreement with each other that will call this object before me something with two syllables, table. I've had friends jokingly on Facebook ask me if we just agreed that red is red. You know that old thing. When you're a kid and you're wondering, is your red the same as my red in terms of a color? So this has nothing whatever to do with reality, but by this kind of symbolic agreement, you and I then are able to reason about these objects. Already language, the use of symbols, is a way of transcending the immediate relationship, and through our self-awareness, it shows the capacity to reason, to deal with ourselves. And then he goes on, I'll just continue a little bit more. Another prominent way this is shown is in science. In science, by abstraction, we can establish laws of nature and control nature. And isn't that a wonderful thing? So we are on YouTube. Another way this capacity of man is seen is in art. When Picasso was able to paint this picture of Guernica, this modern fragmentized and torn apart man, already in the painting, hideous and tragic as it may seem to you, the fragmentization of man is transcended. We are able then to experience this splitting up of modern man, and by experiencing it, to take some stand in relation to it and to transcend it. It may seem to you that modern art, in its abstraction and its often despairing and tumultuous endeavor to present by color and distorted form the inner condition of modern man, simply represents ugliness. Now, it does not at all if one understands what the modern artist is doing. It rather is a way of experiencing what he sees in modern life, saying this in a form that already transcends the situation. And whether you're a mystic or not doesn't matter, or a philosophic type doesn't matter, but this transcendent attitude aspect of things is very important. And if you don't have the ability or the imagination to be able to do that, or to see through things, or see the interrelationships of things and represent them on a deeper level, then you're deficient as a person. You for some reason, that's my belief anyway. And it causes all manner of problems ideologically with lots of certain types of people who want to see things in absolute truths that aren't absolute, and they're not truths. The fourth way is this capacity to be aware of what is happening and then to transcend it is shown in human beings, is of course in religion. By religion here I mean the capacity to ask the meaning of life. I do not mean the particular answers, which are the particular dogma, right or wrong, valuable or not as they may be. I mean rather the capacity of man to ask what the meaning of life is. Here we have a parallel to reason, to science, and to art. The expression of man, the creative self taking a view of his life that involves freedom, responsibility, and the hope, at least, of molding his relation to life with greater meaning. So then he talks about how the religious revival in the United States is shallow because it's become materialistic, it's become, marketing, it's become magic, and it's less about that difficult personal journey of discovering meaning of life, or life and meaning, or something like that. John Vervaeke kind of stuff. And it's true. I mean, prosperity gospel. Was Jesus a capitalist, or was he a socialist, or was he a pacifist, or was he a warrior or a king or a conqueror or a savior or whatever? It's ridiculous because obviously those terms didn't exist back then. And so if you really want to understand Jesus, you have to look at Jesus in a historical context and figure out what culture was like back then, what languages were being used, and what the meaning of life was to people back in the Iron Age, way back when. And now we've updated our religious practice to include all manner of, multimedia and, charismatic preachers all talking about how profound this let there be light thing is. And I think you can find meaning in everything, in literature and art, and your activities, your yoga, your exercise, your relationships, your business, in religion, religious practice, in philosophical musings, poetry, music, science, obviously, data analysis, design, engineering. It's all meaningful to one degree or another, and it's all profound depending on how you treat it as an individual. So he goes on about that kind of stuff, and then I'll take it up again. More stuff in the next video. But again, I'm just always amazed when I read the older people back in the mid-20th century or 19th or 18th century, and I see how we're still wrestling with the same things, and how interesting it is that all of these imaginative, creative, and expert, professional people, as well as mystics and artists, were able to give a unique voice to these common puzzles or tropes or attitudes of discovery that human beings have been going through since ancient times. So it is true what Nassim Taleb talks about, where if a book's reprinted 50 years later, it's more likely that it'll be reprinted in another 50 years. And if it's reprinted in 100 years, it's more likely to be reprinted in 1,000 years, and so on and so forth, because they still have profound meaning. And we can learn a lot from their perspective, even though they're not exactly like ours. They may not be politically correct. It may not be cool to say mankind now, but we have to listen to each other and learn from each other. You don't burn books, you don't destroy statues, you learn from them. That's my opinion anyway. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Tell your friends if they're interested in thinking about stuff like this. Thank you again. William T. Out.